Hi everybody, and welcome to the latest VodCast for Honors Biology at Desert Ridge High School. I'm Mr. Galladay, and today we're talking about genetic shifts in populations. Well, what the heck is a genetic shift in population, you might ask? Well, of course, that is a change in relative frequency. And today we're going to be learning 3 different ways that that can happen. So this is a good place to update the organization in your notebooks, and here we go. Okay, so first thing that we ought to talk about is what the heck is relative frequency? Is that how often my grandma comes to visit? No, of course, that's not what it is. Relative frequency is the relative frequency of alleles. That means how often does a particular gene variant or a particular mutation or a particular allele show up in a population relative to other alleles. Okay, and the example, of course, that we used in a previous podcast is this idea of polydactyly. And polydactyly, of course, means that you have an extra digit, or in this case, an extra finger on your hands, probably one on your feet as well. And so what this means is how often in the population does this happen? And of course, polydactyly, as we all know, is relatively rare, despite the fact that that is a dominant allele. Okay, so Mr. Galladay, are you talking about the six-fingered man?
Hello! My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die! No!
Offer me money.
Yes.
Power to promise me that.
All that I have and more. Please.
Offer me everything I ask for.
Anything you want.
Yes, that of course is from the Princess Bride, where the famous six-fingered man you just saw getting skewered by the famous Inigo Montoya, who you killed my father, now prepare to die. And if you've never seen the Princess Bride, you ought to check it out. It has nothing to do with genetics, but it's a fun movie. Okay, so moving along, how does relative frequency change? Now that we know what relative frequency is, how does it change? Well, there's really 3 different ways. The first is something called genetic drift. Genetic drift, as we're going to see, is a completely random process. And then the next 2 are not random at all. The first is something that has been humans have been doing. We call that artificial selection. And this is how all of our domestic crops and domestic animals have all come into being. And the third is something called natural selection. So we're going to look at all 3 of these different processes, and we'll look at them in some detail. First one is genetic drift, and as we said, genetic drift is a random process. It's when relative frequency changes due to random occurrences. In some cases, you might have individuals who reproduce better. In other cases, you might have individuals that get eliminated by random chance. So if we imagine this population of insects, where we've got a bunch of different varieties, we've got some that are brown, some that are green, and then some guy comes along and squishes a bunch of the green ones. Well, guess what? That random occurrence has just changed the relative frequency of that green allele. So now our population looks much different than it did before. That's genetic drift. Besides people with big feet squishing bugs, we can also have a tornado that just by random chance happens to take out a number of different individuals in a population. And so after that event, we have a change in the relative frequency of frog colors, right? So that particular allele, that brown allele, just by random chance got eliminated or reduced from the population. Okay, so that's genetic drift. It's a purely random occurrence. And the next 2, so important thing is to know that that is a random process when we talk about genetic drift. The next 2 are not random. Okay, so artificial selection, what is that? Well, that's what people do when they breed animals or breed plants. They select individuals that have traits that they want, and they don't breed the individuals that don't have the traits that they want. So we start off with some wild ancestor, and we select for the desirable traits, and we select against the undesirable traits. So if you got a skinny chicken that doesn't lay many eggs, well, guess what? We're not going to keep that one. But if you've got a big fat chicken that lays lots of eggs, well, you're going to select that for breeding, and you're going to breed lots and lots and lots of those chickens. One example of this is a plant called teosinte, which has been around since before people were in America, and so it is native to Mexico and Central America. People found this plant and they found that it had these little bitty seeds on it which were pretty tasty. So they began to cultivate it and they began to select the individuals that had more and more of those little seeds. And now we have our modern corn plant, which we have evolved from that ancient, that original ancestor. Well, how did this happen? Well, it happened by having a wild population that had a relatively few number of seeds per plant and relatively small numbers of seeds. And so our relative frequency of alleles looked something like this. Now, this is a polygenic trait, so all of those alleles look like this. The genes that caused there to be a relative few number of seeds, well, those were very common in the population. Ones that had that caused a large number of seeds, those were a little more rare in the population. After selective breeding, the phenotypes changed, which means that the alleles, the relative frequency of alleles, changed by the selective breeding. So that's an example of corn. Another example of a plant that people have used in a variety of different ways is a plant called Brassica oleracea. And this is a plant which is native both to North America and to Europe. And it's commonly called a wild mustard. It has little yellow flowers and dark green leaves. By selecting these plants and selecting the individuals that had great big leaves, we developed our kale. By selecting big fat stems with big flowers, we developed broccoli. By selecting individuals that had clusters of flowers, we developed cauliflower. By selecting the terminal bud, which is the bud which grows on the tip, and selecting those individuals that had lots of those, we developed cabbage. By selecting individuals that had lots of these lateral buds, which are buds that grow on the side of the plant, we develop Brussels sprouts. And even this kohlrabi, which you may not be familiar with, but is another relative. All of these different plants all came from the same wild ancestor, just by selecting different traits. Same thing with our modern domestic dogs. Those all were selected and were bred from wolves, which were the ancestors of all of our domestic dogs. And again, just by selecting for particular traits and selecting against the traits that we didn't want, well, we've got everything from Pekingese to Huskies. And everything in between have all been developed from the same wild ancestor. Okay, there's a couple of conclusions or a couple important things I think from artificial selection that you should know and that you should keep in mind. The first of them is that wild populations of plants and animals contain lots and lots and lots of genetic variation that's not obvious. Sometimes we just walk by and we see, oh, that's this flower or that animal or this bug, and they all look the same to us. And unless you study that animal in great detail or that plant in great detail, you would not be aware of the variation that exists in the population. So there's lots of variation that exists in wild populations. The other thing is that we can, by selectively breeding, we can find variants that are quite rare, and by selecting those, they can become very common. So the ears of corn, which were big and had lots and lots of kernels on them, well, those all came from that little plant that had those little tiny seeds and little tiny clusters. And again, just by selecting for these, this type of plant is now much more common than this type of plant. You're much more likely to run into one of these than you are into one of these. Two important conclusions from what we can observe by and what we know about artificial selection. Okay, so that brings us to our third way that we can change relative frequency of alleles, and that is natural selection. Well, what is natural selection? Well, that is basically the process where individuals in a population that have advantages to survival, or some advantage that helps them to reproduce better, they leave more offspring. Well, if they leave more offspring, they will pass those traits on to those offspring, and that trait eventually becomes more common in the population. In this case, it's not humans that are selecting the particular trait, it's the environment that selects the trait. So if those advantages are something that are genetic, if they're something that are inherited, those are passed on to the offspring, and those inherited traits eventually become more common. We say that those traits are selected for. On the other hand, if there is an inherited trait that makes an individual less likely to survive, less likely to leave offspring, well, then we say that that particular trait is selected against. And those types of traits are going to become less common in the population. So natural selection in lots of ways works very much the same as artificial selection that people have been doing for a number of years. The difference is who does the selecting. In artificial selecting, it's humans that select the traits. In natural selection, it's the environment that selects for the traits and selects against the traits. So for natural selection to take place, there are really three conditions that have to be met. The first is that we have a genetic variation. We have a population that has genetic variation. If we have a population of all clones, then of course natural selection can't take place. So if you have a population that has genetic variation, you've met the first criteria. The second one is that different individuals in a population are leaving more surviving offspring. So what that means is some individuals have lots of babies, some individuals have fewer babies. And so again, if you have that taking place, well, then you probably have a population in which natural selection is taking place. And then the third is that some of those differences in reproduction are due to some form of genetic difference, right? If there's some genetic variation that is causing some individuals to have more or fewer offspring, and you have the other two conditions, then you have a population that is evolving by natural selection. Okay, now all of this, of course, one thing that most people are familiar with, they've heard the term survival of the fittest. And so this often brings up the question of, well, what do we mean by fitness? What is the fittest? And that is a term that has a lot of meanings in our society and in our culture. And so what do we mean by fitness in this particular context? Well, what fitness means is how well an organism can survive and reproduce in a particular environment. Fitness, of course, refers to the likelihood that an individual or some trait will allow an individual to leave more offspring. It's reproduction, really, and the success of reproduction that determines fitness for a particular individual. So what does that mean? Well, if an individual is less fit in one environment, they may be more fit in a different environment. So again, different traits have advantages or disadvantages in different environments. We're going to be seeing lots and lots and lots of examples of this in class over the next week or so. So I'm not including many examples here because we're going to look at several examples in class of this. The other thing about fitness is that individuals that have a high degree of fitness, that means that they are more likely to pass their genes to offspring than an individual that has a low level of fitness. So this really doesn't have anything to do with how many laps you can run or how fast you can run or how much you can bench press or anything like that we sometimes associate with fitness in our human culture. It mostly refers to an individual's ability to pass genes on to the next generation. Okay, so that kind of concludes all the information, but there are some review questions that I would like you to include on the left-hand page of your notebook. So if you would review, what do we mean by a population? What do we mean by relative frequency? What are three ways that relative frequency can change? What do we mean by artificial selection, genetic drift, and natural selection? what is it that evolves by natural selection? And then two or actually three conditions required for natural selection, and what do we mean by fitness? The other important thing to know is what do we mean by selected for and selected against? These are all terms and concepts that you need to be familiar with before you conclude this vodcast. So that's all I've got for you today. I'm Mr. Galladay for Honors Biology at Desert Ridge High School, and I hope you have a great day.